Excellent. So yes, once again, thank you so much for joining us for today's Camunda New York meetup on process orchestration being a tool in your enterprise architecture tool belt. My name, as previously mentioned, is Jacob Plicque. I'm a senior developer advocate at Camunda. I live in Jacksonville, Florida. Big time, huge nerd, comic books, D&D, video games, all that stuff. At work, I'm pretty focused on building content and community for enterprise architects. But this isn't just a presentation for enterprise architects, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. They sort of live in a lot of different worlds. And so hopefully whether you're on the DevOps side, developer side, the business side, or just curious about something new, hopefully this is helpful for you. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about. Our agenda is going to talk a little bit about why Batman, one thought about Batman inspired this talk track. What do enterprise architects do anyway? What's actually in a enterprise architecture tool belt, some challenges from an enterprise architecture perspective, and how does process orchestration help in all that? I also want a quick note, programming note, so to speak. If there are questions and things like that, I don't know if there's a chat function. I assume there is. I won't be able to see it, so we'll tackle those at the end if we need to. So first of all, Batman. I've actually thought this for a while, like that be a amazing enterprise architect. The way that he studies and visualizes the city of Gotham, creates solutions to take out the bad guys, and the many tools he has in that wildly yellow utility belt that he has on his belt there. So he's constantly thinking about the bigger picture and how everything moves while staying focused on the mission at hand. A bit like an architect mindset, I'd say. Now, maybe that's a stretch for you, or you're not a big super comic book nerd, or don't even know what or who Batman is. Totally fair. But enterprise architects don't just look at IT architecture. They need to understand the company's mission and in sufficient detail to make informed purchases and architecture decisions across the enterprise. So enterprise architects commonly make high-level design choices on all things IT, proposing technical standards, coding standards, tools, and platforms. So the reality of an enterprise architect is every day you're driving change by tying the business and IT landscapes together. You're consistently translating the needs of the business to the IT teams. And while they may have difficulty getting on the same page, you sort of sit right in the middle of it all, navigating your organization towards success. So what tools are in said tool belt, and what do you have at your disposal if you're an enterprise architect, for example? So there are visual diagrams. You're visualizing what your systems look like via a series of images that tie your infrastructure and application together via real-world scenarios, hopefully, if they exist, that is. Sometimes, and I've seen it, kind of flying blind. Creating collaboration between the business and IT teams, ensuring that everyone's on the same page. So not just a physical tool per se, like expertise, for example. A lot of the architects that I've worked with have an incredible amount of experience, 10 plus years sometimes. And talking about data and distribution, how does data flow from one application to another? What dependencies are there? Are they mapped? Are they documented? Performance benchmarking. What is the behavior of our systems when things are running well? When do things begin to fall over as we hit a certain amount of traffic? Or do things fall over even before that? And then also like kind of miscellaneous best practices around security, API gateways, event-driven architectures, things like that. So a quick note, just as an example around something like order fulfillment. This is sort of a diagram of a kind of fairly common walkthrough for fulfillment center. You're thinking like your Amazons, your Targets, your Walmarts, your Fanatics. You have an order service, payment service, inventory, shipping. In this case, this diagram is utilizing a sort of a Kafka messaging sort of queuing sort of system. If you've been familiar, we'll talk about BPMN in a second. You might see some pretty common images that you've seen before. But meanwhile, at the Legion of Doom, A quick personal note. I first became a really invested in cloud engineering about a decade ago. I just got promoted to our cloud engineering team at the company I was working for at the time. Was really, really excited to learn. And one of my onboarding exercises, and this is actually a picture from this particular week, was to meet with the architect on our team. And I remember he walked up to a whiteboard and walked me through what all of our services looked like at this classic 10,000 foot overview. And I remember bombarding him with question after question. How does this work? Where is this documented? When's the last time we tested this failover scenario? And I remember we were looking at a Confluence document that had just had names of services. And I kept asking, okay, well, like, what about when this falls over? What's the failover scenario for this? And he kind of sort of shrugged with a bit of a grin and show me some outdated documentation, which is when I realized a lot of this lived inside of his head or didn't really exist at all. So, but for architects, it's not about how many tools are in your tool belt, but how and when they're used. The business folks don't necessarily care about the nitty gritty work the IT team is doing to create horizontal scaling across a variety of servers, or all that work you're doing to tune that timeout logic. But what they care about is the impact that those decisions have on the rest of the business, as well as your customers. Meanwhile, your customers' expectations have never been higher. Immediate gratification, little to no patience. I read somewhere recently that most consumers will only give a business 2 to 3 chances before leaving them forever. In my mind, I was thinking try one with like a negative Yelp review right afterwards, for example. So to the business side, it feels like IT is ignoring the needs of the business. And to the IT side, it feels like the business side doesn't respect them or their workload. So who lives in the middle of that friction? The enterprise architect. Kind of like Spider-Man in Spider-Man Homecoming, holding up these two, was once one fairy, now split in two, or like Spider-Man holding a bus on one side, a train on another. You have to balance both of these teams' needs while also driving home business value. Meanwhile, how's that documentation look, by the way? Those visualizations up to date? What's missing? What about those failover scenarios, right? So kind of a live look into what an enterprise architect kind of looks like every day. Big Spider-Man fan, if you couldn't tell by the hat. So Biz Design has this really awesome state of the enterprise architecture report they released this year, where it states that enterprise architects need to marry those expectations with the rising need to cut costs while also driving the conversation between business value and IT implementation. So things can get really, really messy. So there's business requirements that also change rapidly, and then IT teams start saying, no, we're good. We're going to go our own way instead. No offense. Furthermore, in this report, only 29.5% of respondents fully agreed that their enterprise architecture practice delivered business outcomes, which was a big surprise for me. And we're thinking better business insights, identification of innovation opportunities, improved customer experience, faster time to market, things like that. Then there's the big word that a lot of people are scared of: change. The reality is that change is inevitable. It's incredibly challenging to take advantage of the technical innovations of our time without it. Not to mention, it's difficult to deliver the digital transformation that almost every company is attempting to deliver to keep up with their competitors without full visibility into their environment. Where enterprise architects come in really effectively, though, is balancing the needs of that business and IT implementation I mentioned earlier, and helping break down those barriers, being that sort of interpreter between both groups. But what's missing? It's the fact that it relies solely on the knowledge of said architect to tie so many different things together, and technically, while also attempting to manage that relationship between business and IT, all while driving home value across the board. Fortunately, this is where process orchestration can really help. So if you're unfamiliar with it, process orchestration coordinates the various moving parts of a business process, sometimes even tying multiple processes together. It helps you work with the people, systems, and devices you already have while achieving even the most ambitious goals around end-to-end process automation. Here at Camunda, we actually focus a lot on business process orchestration, which we believe results in process automation. So let's talk about the power of it that allows enterprise architects to connect the business and IT stakeholders. It shows that not just the stakeholders, by the way, but the entire organization that we can do this. So we can visualize what's actually happening. As much as we love those whiteboarding architecture overview meetings that try to explain all the moving pieces, it's likely that what's drawn and what's actually implemented aren't the same. With process orchestration, that's no longer the case. What's designed is exactly what's implemented and executed. Also, we talked about language a little earlier, aligning business and IT using a common standards-based model and language. We'll talk about this a little more later. Now, taming complexity. You don't need to eliminate complexity, and for the most part, that's pretty impossible. Instead, you can help tame it through end-to-end orchestration across your customer journey. And then driving home business outcomes, which is a big deal, especially since it's a struggle based off of that report earlier. Organizations are more likely to invest in enterprise architecture teams if they can drive home value to the business. So with process orchestration, when you're doing it, it's much easier to tie the business and IT value conversation together. We're both on the same team, essentially. So how do we get started? So let's talk about BPMN, which stands for Business Process Management and Notation, which is the ISO standard for modeling and execution. If you're not familiar with it, some folks here probably are, but just to make sure we're on the same page, I wanted to go over it. You can visualize how all your processes perform, detect bottlenecks with ease, get notifications about errors. You can use machine learning to recognize patterns, dive into heat maps to see what's really happening. That's more on the orchestration side. And I mentioned earlier, I know some folks likely already use this. So this is a really large blueprint of a telco order fulfillment. I want to give a shout out to Till Stadler, who's on our consulting team, for putting this one together. So when we start to collaborate using BPMN, we start to think of our systems in different ways, not just infrastructure and applications, but processes in which our customers interact with. I have an old mentor of mine that would always talk about respecting production, and this is where our customers live. But I actually think they live here in our processes. Whether it's, and also with those infrastructure and application conversations, we sort of leave out our low code developers, our business analysts. Like what happens when you hand a GitHub link to a business analyst? And there's no offense to them. That's not their purview. So you can instead hand them this end-to-end process, and it will super make a lot of sense. We could talk a little bit about, for example, just to tie in a couple of things, what our mobile provisioning looks like and what, for example, our fraud check looks like. What happens when we have sufficient inventory? How does that impact us? Okay, so that's one process, great. But where do we go from there? So there's this strategic orchestration approach that we've been working on at Camunda that should be applied to every project that you want to kick off. So it allows you to strategically position a new project into whatever the existing process landscape looks like. It helps you build new processes with a strong customer focus. And it allows you to define and measure process KPIs from your first day, easily proving value of the project itself. So, for example, let's locate a process that's newly to be orchestrated on our landscape. This allows us to easily find the start and end point of the process and helps to follow and benefit from industry standards and, honestly, tribal knowledge. Then from there, we can define different customer touch points. So we detail the end-to-end process with really important customer-facing events like customer documents obtained for like a mortgage or something, or like a quote created and an appraisal is finished, for example, from like a loan perspective. Then we can define process goals and KPIs. We can create a process profile describing the process and defining the process goals and KPIs. So we can derive process goals from the given business strategy, whether that's reducing cost, increasing quality, speed, you're trying to accelerate, defining KPIs to measure those goals. And you can define some internal targets or use industry standards as thresholds for these KPIs. Quick optional note, you can validate your business case with tracking. And you can use that to calculate different KPIs based off of what the existing system events are, like as an intermediate step before orchestrating it. And then you can do that. So most often we see approaches similar to this one sketched out. Now, of course, even though the approach shown in this visual here appears to be to follow a straight line, that's almost never the case in real life. Solutions are best created in a bit of an agile fashion, continually delivering business value in small iterations and not by following rigid waterfall models. So let's kind of go through the various steps in the solution sort of creation approach, kind of zooming down a little bit. So from a discovery perspective, we're identifying a process to orchestrate and defining the business case for that automation project. Then we're capturing business objectives and then defining success metrics. Now, it should be clear not only why a process should be automated, but which metrics will define the success of it. So for example, that's like cycle times or a reduced amount of human work, increased sales via better customer experiences. This is a step that we actually see pretty overlooked, which actually makes it really hard to communicate value later on, while also missing an opportunity to align everybody on a common goal. And then defining ownership and roles. Before you kick off a solution, it's really important to understand how it's connected with the business domains that are holding the use case together. We really advocate for things like clear process ownership and the roles and enablement that are needed to deliver that initiative. Then, of course, the model to be should be really clear, understandable, and precise, as it'll be the basis for the executable process later. Although the primary focus should, of course, be on the process to be, this is where the value will begin to come from. So it's often really helpful to capture the as-is process first, whatever it is, and make sure everybody's on the same page to better understand the changes needed to implement the process. Just based off time, let's skip ahead. So we'll go develop really fast. Next up in the development of the solution, which means adding all the technical details needed to make the process executable. Like, for example, this can involve expressions to implement decision points. That's the gateway symbol, for example. Glue code to integrate different service calls, configuration of connectors, user interfaces, things like that. Development should also include writing automated tests. Testing is really important, just across an SDLC, for example, software development lifecycle, if you didn't know. At least for solutions with a certain level of criticality. So let's talk about run. The solution is only going to generate business value once it's running in production. This kind of talks a little bit earlier about where our customers live, right? So the phase includes setting up the real deployment environment, even if this is hopefully handled at either a service by either like your SaaS vendor, or if you have like an internal team that owns this, like a center of excellence, for example. Also, before putting your solution in production, you want to make sure that you have a level of change management for the people that will be impacted. So, for example, if you need to switch to using a new task management user interface, or otherwise need to change the way that they do their work. Communication, obviously, super important. Then the delivery team needs to actually operate the solution and watch out for any incidents that might happen. Really important. That's part of change management. So what we see is that we have it's really common for there to be a two-layered approach about this. Your IT team runs the technical ops, perhaps with somebody on call, for example. If you have a platform as a service that's like in-house, for example, those are people that are typically connected to that same team in some capacity, and hopefully resolve any failures in the underlying platform themselves. There's also sometimes where solution teams operate their own platforms. Think your old school, well, I guess not old school, DevOps methodology or platform engineering as we see now a lot, in which case they typically resolve those problems as well. But as soon as there's that first iteration in production, you can begin to implement the next iteration and making improvements or simply implementing the next process phase. And then lastly, from a monitoring perspective, you want to continuously track value, making sure that You implement automatic capturing of the KPIs you define at the beginning of the project, probably with this process intelligence tool, hopefully. And in the case of Camunda, that's what we use. And the platform will help you automatically capture all relevant data and provide real-time dashboards for executives. This was really important for us when we used to work at a company called Fanatics, where we had an hourly report of what we made, what we were scheduled to make, and what we were making, and how the different changes we were making could impact that. So we get a lot of questions around maturity levels for process orchestration, how adoption should work, and where it typically should look. So we wanted to, actually, this is from CommunityCon last year, I want to say. So we put together a maturity model that helps you identify the 5 different stages of maturity, or like an organization's comfort level and ability to execute different projects and strategies across a number of different drivers. So single projects, typically where you start, obviously, or you're not doing it at all. Then it sort of dovetails into a broader initiative, and then eventually distributed adoption, and then hopefully strategically scaled one. So let's talk a little bit about enterprise architecture and showing how process orchestration can be this like glitter glue for business capabilities to form end-to-end processes. So first, you want to concentrate on end-to-end customer journeys to ensure that you don't get lost in internal details that don't really matter to your customers. And then secondly, you want to use this approach that allows you to be really flexible, so you can easily adjust how your processes work, add new requirements, automate, and then improve. And then thirdly, it also allows you to introduce completely new business models or customer journeys as you need to. So here in this slide, the end-to-end process is like this elevated concept, but you don't really want to have layers in your business capabilities. So how do we put this together? We actually can take like a pragmatic route here and use this as a emphasize to the important role of an end-to-end process and their relationship to customer journeys. But we can change the viewpoint of if we dive into something like a business capability. So if this visualization doesn't work for you, not a big deal. Don't use it. Just talk about business capabilities. But if you want to communicate end-to-end processes as first-class citizens, this would work just fine. So either way, both approaches are valid. They're just different perspectives on the same reality. Just depending on who you're talking to, you may want to adjust the communication strategy that you use. And then this is a big slide. We won't dive into a lot of the details, but from a community perspective, I wanted to talk about, which is a platform we know best, some tools that we're talking about a lot. So the heart of the platform being this process orchestration engine, defining, managing, and executing those sequences, tasks, and steps that constitute that automated process, for example. There's also, we're not going to talk a lot about this today, but there's a decision engine to help execute things like decision logic in the form of decision tables in BPMN, which also allows you to actually automate a lot of those decisions based off of predefined rules and conditions. Really helpful for things like, as we move forward, like human task management, processes that involve people. They need a way to manage those tasks in case that there are things that are not ready to be automated yet. So, for example, we have a taskless application and forms, and let's see what else. That's what I thought. There we go. We'll just keep going. Technical operations. So platforming that uses actually, let's back up. So for operate, in the case of Camunda, we have operate. So if you've got like a problem with like a service call to like a CRM system, for example, you really need some level of monitoring that will recognize that problem, because incidents aren't awesome. They are really, don't be wrong, failure is sometimes good in the fact of like there are places for you to learn, but the business probably wouldn't like that too much. So you want to send alerts or integrate something like this with your existing application performance monitoring, like an APM tool like Honeycomb, New Relic, Datadog has that as well. And a couple of extra notes around connectors. We talked about that a little earlier. This is a great way to accelerate projects and really scale out processes as they move to different pieces of the enterprise. So obviously, a lot that we could talk about even further. If we want to go back, we can. But want to be conscious of time. So of course, real life's way more complicated than simple architecture diagrams. So even though we've seen plenty of simplified versions and we've got plenty of those, no doubt, still valuable, but versus real life. But we also see that typically technical capabilities are used by different development teams, multiple in most cases, and in the organization. And technologically, most things are pretty domain agnostic. So you can kind of use the same process orchestration platform, whether you're using Camunda or not. You can use that for order fulfillment. You can use it for billing. You can use it for payments. And besides your process orchestration platform, there's also your databases, your document storage. You have your container orchestration layers as well. Those are typically owned by IT and provided as like a service to our organization. That's where that sort of platform engineering mindset comes in. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule for sure. From a business capability perspective, there's business departments that implement those domains. So there's like a group that owns a group in IT, for example, that owns an application or a microservice that actually implements a business capability. These are typically where those meetings, those architecture meetings we joked about a little earlier, come in. So while this is all right, there should probably be a clear owner on the business side collaborating closely with IT. And as IT can't really manage those requirements for those capabilities on their own, in contrast to, say, technical capabilities where that's totally fine. So all that to say, providing a technical capability around process orchestration as a platform will help you in delivering more business capabilities that leverage process orchestration, for example. And there's actually a really great way to measure success. We talked a little bit about KPIs here a little earlier. Some really common ones are around increasing developer productivity, efficiency and cost savings, for example, improving quality, reducing complexity, and even like process mindset and even like stakeholder enablement. There's actually a couple things to dive into around efficiency and cost savings. That's a really, really common one nowadays. So increased efficiency of your development teams will do things like save you effort and making completing projects quicker and cheaper. While it typically won't lead to a reduced headcount, hopefully, it means that you can improve your developer productivity and automate more with your existing setup, leading to things like further efficiencies and cost savings. And then almost lastly, we'll talk a little bit about what a roadmap to this sort of adoption, that mountain we saw a little earlier, could look like. So we can distinguish that with three different phases of adoption. The first being discovery. So you can assess your current operation approach, defining your target state and scope, identifying solutions and use cases, then building a roadmap and then a timeline. This is really common for enterprise architects outside of process orchestration. So it's a really effective tool here. And then lastly, of course, execute on it. Then from a delivery perspective, organizations focusing on implementing process orchestration solutions, they design the architecture, set up the chosen platform, we'll say Camunda in this case, and then initiate those first use cases. That actually might be another place for that center of excellence or that team that owns it to be heavily involved in those first projects. And then from there, once there's like a successful implementation, it begins to create that culture of learning that impacts that team. And then after the groundwork's done, you can fulfill a few additional domains that will start to adopt process orchestration and then laying the groundwork for that scaling effect. Speaking of that, more delivery work streams are added, expanding orchestration across the organization. This phase actually enables enterprises to maximize the benefits of orchestration, improving efficiency and agility. And across all phases, it's really important to provide ongoing communication to all of the relevant stakeholders and things like value tracking for the initiatives through those corresponding KPIs we talked about a little earlier. So lastly, so let's kind of, all that to say, that was a lot, I'm sure. I feel like I could do 4 different talks. This is just the beginning. So if this is something that's interesting to you, great. And we can start by just visualizing and implementing what's true and not just whiteboarding things. Make sure that the business and IT teams are on the same page, using BPMN and process orchestration for everyone to use the same language. And if all of that didn't make sense, or like me, you got ADHD, and it's like, cool, what's like the one thing to help me get started? Think about a top level strategic diagram first. We don't have to worry about the adoption right now. Let's start with something easy to understand first. Then go and fulfill that business process, and then go deeper from there. So, a couple of things on top of that. Oh, actually, one last thing. When the dive deeper comes in, making sure that you still have a business outcome in mind is really, really important. So that's almost it. I've got a blog post on this coming really, really soon. We've got Camunda Academy available. There's a certification program as well. And I'm always hanging out in our community forum where you can join the conversation with other enterprise architects as they explore Camunda, its ecosystem, BPMN, process orchestration. Essentially, you don't need to be Bruce Wayne to get started with this. Quick note around, especially since this is the Camunda New York meetup, we have a conference coming up in a couple months. So I'll be there. A bunch of our team will be there as well. So come hang out. Lots of stuff to learn and teach as well. So that's about it. You can find me and email me. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff.